So welcome everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Matthew Jarron. I'm the museum curator at the University of Dundee, and we're one of the museums that is part of the Tayside Museums Forum, which is an organisation that basically supports and promotes the various museums across Tayside. And this is the third annual event that we've done showcasing the various treasures that we have in our collections. So this is Tayside Treasures 3, or Son of Tayside Treasures, whatever you want to call it. If you're interested in the previous two, if you missed them, we do have recordings of those on our YouTube channel, and we can share links with those later on as well. So we'll start off with our first speaker. So delighted to welcome Keren Guthrie from Blair Castle. We have asked each of our museums to choose one object, but Keren's cheating by choosing a pair of crowns, but we'll let you away with that, Keren. So we'll hand over to you, Keren.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, so fingers crossed. Okay, everyone's got that.
Looks good.
So I'm from Blair Castle. I don't know about everybody else, but it's an absolutely stunning day up here. And you might hear the pipes in the background because our piper is out just now. So, but today I'm going to speak to you about our coronets. So essentially a coronet is a crown in miniature. The coronet is primarily a distinguishing sign of rank, and it's reserved for the nobility and peers of the realm. A ducal crown or coronet is an ornamented circlet, and it dates back to the time of Charles II. The coronets you see here are ducal, and we know this not only because they're part of the Blair Castle collection, but we can tell this because of the decoration of the crown itself. Normally constructed of a silver gilt circlet with the crimson velvet. I think ours is slightly faded, trimmed with ermine for around the base and topped with the little gold tassels that you can see. Each of the 5 ranks of peerage have a distinctly different coronets. A ducal coronet has 8 strawberry leaves, whereas a marquis also has the silver gilt circlet, but it has 4 strawberry leaves, and in between each is a ball or a pearl. And you'll see on these ones that we don't have that, obviously, because we're dukes. So the coronets and robes were created to reflect or copy those of the king or queen, but without the jewels. So the peers would enter the coronation bareheaded, and they would only wear their coronets as the monarch is crowned. And this is an acknowledgement by the peers that their status flows from the crown. So differing in size considerably, you can see that here. Both coronets would have been attached to the head of the wearer with pins and ribbons. The lady's coronet is considerably smaller and would have been perched on her head, sometimes by pinning the hair up inside the coronet before finally securing it with ribbons. And making it obviously particularly secure because they wouldn't want to avoiding any embarrassing slips or tilts. One duke, I have it reliably informed, apparently even kept a sandwich in his coronet, and given that a coronation can take up to 8 hours, I suppose he might well have got peckish. Our coronets were made for the coronation of King George IV, and we can tell this from some of the documentation in the archive. There are accounts and invoices for the robes and the coronets. Also in the archive are very specific instructions issued by the royal household with regard to what each peer should wear in the order of the ceremony, even down to where and when they would be dining. Our particular coronets were worn by Bardi and Kitty, so that's the 8th Duke and Duchess of Atholl. Unfortunately, Kitty took ill just before they attended London, so the Duke had to go to the ceremony on his own. But he did manage to purchase the 2 chairs that the couple would have occupied during the ceremony, and these are currently on display in the castle. So these particular cornets were last used on the 24th of June 1953, when Queen Elizabeth was ceremonially presented with the honours of Scotland, the Scottish jewels. Ian, as you can see here, he's the 10th Duke of Atholl. He wore his full Atholl Highlander uniform as Commander-in-Chief of the Atholl Highlanders, and he also wore his ducal peer robes on top. So I can imagine it was extremely hot. He mentions in the Atholl Chronicles walking with the Duke of Argyll and his wife from Tollcross to Parliament House. And then along with 50 other Scottish peers, they attended St Giles Cathedral to see Queen Elizabeth receive the crown, the sceptre and the sword. The cornets are currently on display in the castle as part of the Castle Couture exhibition, and although they weren't used for the recent coronation of Charles III. I hope you've enjoyed that. And it tells you a little bit about our coronets.
Thank you so much, Keren. That was great. I love the idea of keeping your sandwiches in them as well. It's brilliant. Folks, I should say that because we're just going to go straight from talk to talk, we won't have time for speakers to answer questions in person, but if you have any questions for Keren or for any of the speakers, do please write them in the chat, and the speakers will answer them in the chat as well. So very welcome to do that. Right, so let's move on to our second speaker. We're delighted to be coming to Dundee and the V&A Dundee, and we have Louise Dickson, who's got a very interesting object for us, the design for a public urinal. So Louise, hand over to you.
Thank you. So my name is Louise Dickson. I'm from V&A Dundee. So this is a design for a public urinal in Alexandra Park in Glasgow from 1909. This was installed into the Scottish Design Galleries in November of last year in our latest round of rotations. The provision of public toilets in Glasgow in the 19th and early 20th century was part of the authority's strategy for improving health of the city's poorest residents. A national survey in 1902 revealed that Glasgow was the most overcrowded city in Britain, and poor living conditions meant that cholera, typhus and TB were common, and not helped by the fact that lots of families were forced to share access to outside toilets. Public toilets that appeared over the city instilled civic pride, and they were designed with decorative architectural details like the turrets, which you can see in these designs. They were often, almost always, designed by unnamed individuals at the Office of Public Works. We brought in this object to speak to the design of public toilets and health, but this object was also brought into the gallery as part of our Lavender Labels project. The Lavender Labels are 10 purple labels that were co-written by the museum's LGBTQ+ working group, which reinterpret objects which are already in the gallery from an LGBTQ+ perspective, with the exception of 2 new objects which were brought in specifically as part of this project, this object being one of them. So during the 19th and much of the 20th century, when all forms of sex between men were illegal, men faced difficult choices and significant risks, and with no safe places to meet, some adopted public toilets as spaces for sexual and romantic encounters. From around the 1920s, public toilets became sites of surveillance and arrest, and as the police aimed to remove all manifestations of homosexuality from the public gaze. A variety of tactics were used to entrap men, including the use of agent provocateurs. These civic structures are tangible reminders from the persecution, resilience and resistance of Scotland's gay community. The queering of the Scottish Design Galleries has been ongoing for over a year, with a large amount of research as to how to best represent a queer experience in what is currently a fairly historical gallery, considering language for historical figures that may have not had the words to describe identities in the way that we do now, or have had to live much or all of their lives hidden. We have held 2 research workshops establishing a network of LGBTQ+ individuals, academics and organisations across Scotland, some of whom have become advisors on helping us write these lavender labels. Through this workshop, we have determined it to be of importance to speak about working class queer experience, which is one of the reasons that we chose to tell this story about the public urinals, with working class gay men having even less places to meet, with those who perhaps had homes of their own or could afford hotels, etc. These 2 stories of this object can be seen side by side next to this object in the gallery, with the queer story written by the LGBTQ+ group in purple. On a tangent, I'm going to quickly tell you a little bit about the museum's working group. So we were founded in 2019, which was 2 years after the museum opened. We consult on label writing, most recently on the tartan labels in the museum in the identity section of the show. We advocate for better representation across the organisation and collaborate with groups such as Dundee Pride, Our Story Scotland and LGBT Scotland. We're also about to begin our organisational charter with LGBT Scotland, making us the first museum in Scotland to become chartered with them. Our most notable project has been these lavender labels. We also proposed and organised the accompanying public programme, which comprised of a talk with Adele Patrick from Glasgow Women's Library, Lavender Menace, which is Scotland's first LGBT bookshop, Our Story Scotland, who collect and archive LGBT oral histories from Scottish people, art historian Keith McMillan and historian Glenn Davis. We have more plans to include some more lavender labels at the end of this year. So I don't know if my slide's not changing. Later in this year. So you can see some other objects in my next slide, but it's not moving actually, sorry. So there is some more lavender labels in the gallery, but I'm not going to tell you about them because I love urinals and you just have to come and see the other labels. But in our ongoing queering project, we have found that the stories that we've uncovered so far reflect the lives of mostly gay men due to the time period of the gallery, it being kind of mostly male heavy, and they tell largely quite sad stories of those who have had to hide their identities. And we're looking to bring in some more objects that speak to queer protests and queer joy and reflect some more identities. This design for the public urinal has surprisingly been our most popular lavender label on our school lavender labels tours and the wider public response to the labels. We're also always looking to collaborate with other LGBTQ+ networks and individuals, especially within Dundee and Tayside. And we're currently kind of toying with an idea of creating a Dundee-wide queer cultural collective. So if that's interesting to anyone here, just let me know. So definitely a slight tangent from urinals, but I think hopefully a good one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was really fascinating. And yeah, I think it's a great project, and I know we would certainly be interested in being involved in a collective like that. So keep us posted on that. Great. All right. Well, now we're heading off to Dunkeld, and delighted to welcome Ruth Brown, who's going to tell us about Dr. Gutch's photo album in the Dunkeld Community Archives. So, Ruth, over to you.
Share said screen. Right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about this fabulous photograph album. So a recent acquisition to us. We received a phone call out of blue from a gentleman in North Yorkshire last year, and he had this album with some photographs of Dunkeld in it, and he'd been given it by a lady who was donating stuff to a charity shop which he worked in, and she had told him that she didn't think anybody would want it and just to throw it in the bin. But anyway, so he didn't obviously throw it in the bin. Because we were the main subject in the album, he decided to get in touch with us, which was great. And so when it landed on our doorstep, we started to investigate it. Obviously, the photographs are, the front cover of the album there shows 1857. So we got quite excited about how early they were. So Dunkeld's earliest known photographer is James Murray, and we know he had a studio in Burnham in 1865 because our more well-known photographer, Andrew Finlay Mackenzie, came to work as an assistant for him in that year, and then he took over the business due to James's poor health in 1868. So we were just kind of thinking, could these photographs be the earliest ever ones of Dunkeld, and who exactly was the photographer? So Colin, the gentleman who phoned us up, told us that the lady who gave them to him thought that they were an ancestor of hers, a guy called Mr. Wright, because a lady's name, Mrs. Wright, from Stocking Hall in Crake in North Yorkshire, was written in the back cover of this photo album. So looking at the census records, we couldn't find any Wrights living at that address at that time. We didn't find them living in Stocking Hall until 1901. So we got in touch with Paul Adair at Perth Museum, and also Laura Brown at St Andrews University to come and have a look at the album and give us some advice on it. So Paul did some research of his own, and he came back on the phone to me the next day that he came to see it. And he confirmed to us that the photographer was a gentleman called Dr. John Wheely Gutch. And Paul had identified Dr. Gutch's unique style of creating these albums and also matched his handwriting that's in them. And Laura also confirmed the photographer, and after looking at the album, she didn't think, or she didn't know of any other earlier photographs of Dunkeld. So this was very exciting for us. So the only other known copies of these Scottish photographs are actually held in the Eastman Museum in New York. So that was very exciting. And move on to the next slide. So this is John Wheely Gutch, and he was born in Bristol in 1808, and he trained as a surgeon, but he was also a keen amateur naturalist, geologist, and a pioneer photographer. In 1843, he was appointed one of Queen Victoria's messengers, which took him round the world. But ill health forced him to retire in 1854 from that particular service. So Gutch describes himself as being incapacitated from service by gout. So he suffered with gout and kidney problems, I believe. So following his retirement, he made photographs of family and friends using the half-plate wet collodion negatives. And in 1856, he moved to a Scott Archer wet plate camera, which had the convenience of being able to develop the glass negatives within the camera itself. In 1857, he visited Scotland, which was his only trip north of the border. And he died in April 1862, leaving a widow. His only son had died in Swansea at the age of 4, which is very sad. So this is the camera that Dr. Gutch started to use in 1856, which really kind of helped him with his mobility issues because he didn't have to cart about all the other things to develop the plate. So this particular process was invented by Frederick Scott Archer in 1851. He'd used Talbot's calotype process, which produced paper negatives, but dissatisfied with the results, he soon began his own experiments to develop a more sensitive and finely detailed process. For his experiments, Archer used collodion, a newly discovered substance which was used as a medical dressing, a sticky solution of gun cotton and ether. Collodion dried quickly to produce a tough, transparent, waterproof film. The process he discovered was to coat a glass plate with collodion mixed with potassium iodide and then immersed the plate in sensitizing solution of silver nitrate. Exposed in the camera while still wet, the plate was then developed and fixed immediately. Crisp, detailed negatives were produced by exposures of only a few seconds, and initially called the Archer type, is more commonly known as the wet collodion process, and this dominated photography for the next 30 years. So this is the introductory page of Dr. Gutch's album, the one that we have, and it's decorated with these photogram collages of leaves and feathers, and they're throughout the album, and this is one of his unique kind of designs in his albums, and then sometimes he would put these little verses of poetry in there too. And each of these handcrafted albums they have this title page, so there are either leaves or feathers. It's predominantly feathers that's throughout the title pages within the book that we've got. So he exhibited in Edinburgh and London, and sold his prints through stationers in Bristol and London, but there's no evidence of him ever selling anything on a wider commercial level.
Just going to give you your time warning, Ruth, if that's okay.
Snippets of information, maps and copies of etchings are also kind of in the album. So each of the pages for each of the different places, they have these maps and bits of notes in there. This is the first image that's in the album, and it's Sir Walter Scott's monument. So that must have been rather crisp and new when he first took that photograph. this photograph of Dunkeld Cathedral here. Each of these photographs in the album have got his handwriting at the bottom with the title and the date that he took the photograph. And you can see our bell in the tower there that came down in 1975, but it was still in situ at that time. In the Dunkeld images, there's copies of etchings on the opposite page, but this is only for the Dunkeld ones. And he seems to have had more photographs of Dunkeld in this album. So either the weather was better or he really liked his time in Dunkeld. I do believe somebody did tell me that he had a terrible time in Scotland with the weather interfering with his photography, and he didn't like it. So I think that's maybe why he only had one trip here. So some photographers put themselves into the picture, but this potentially is him on the left-hand side because he did like to put himself in the photograph.
To wrap up, if that's okay, Ruth.
My favourite photograph here, Mrs. Blair's, or the view from Mrs. Blair's lodgings in Dunkeld, and I'm going to quickly flick on to this. This album will be on display at our Living History event in Dunkeld at the end of July, last weekend in July. So if anybody wants to come and see all of the photographs in the actual album, come along to that. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you so much. Sorry to rush you at the end there. Excellent. Lovely, right, well, we're now heading over to Angus, and I think possibly the largest object that we're dealing with today. We're going to be looking at the Glenisla Hearse, and Shona Murray from the National Trust for Scotland is going to be telling about this, which is part of the Angus folk collection on display at the House of Dun. So, Shona, we'll hand over to you.
Hi, so like Matthew just said, my name's Shona and I work at the House of Dun just outside Montrose for the National Trust for Scotland. So I've got the cheery topic of death, just to lighten the mood for everyone here today. So this is an image of the House of Dun. So although I will be focusing on the Glenisla Hearse that's part of the Angus folk collection that's housed here, I kind of wanted to give a bit of a background that actually the estate itself has had a long connection with burial processes and rituals. So this is actually one in a long line of items that we have here that actually ties back to everyone's mortality. So the land has actually been occupied for over 9,000 years. So we're just the tiny bit at the end of that long, long history. One of the items in that history is the Ford House barrow, which was a site of excavation on the estate, and it was used during the Neolithic period as a site for burial and worship. So at the time, people would have been buried within the chambers underneath, or they would have been laid on top, open to the elements, which is again a big drastic change from what we would now be doing in our burial process. So this site was actually used right up until the Bronze Age, so quite a big chunk of history there. In contrast, when the Erskine family started to occupy the site, they used a mausoleum or a graveyard, which again is more traditional in what we would expect to find in burial procedures and traditions. So this is the site, and you can actually walk around the graves of the family and see how many generations actually found their final resting place here on the grounds. But to move on to what we actually want to talk about is the Glenisla Hearse. So as I said, this is the latest in a long line of items that are connected to the traditions and rituals surrounding death. Again, cheery. However, this was not always here. As the title says, it was located in Glenisla. It was actually built in 1865, and it was built for the Kirk of Session in Glenisla. So they commissioned a Dundee carriage manufacturer, Thomas Swinton, to make an elegant hearse for the area. He made it in ebonized wood, which you can see from the image there, a lovely black glossy finish. And it would have been pulled originally by 1 or 2 horses. And these again would have been black, and they would have been ornamented with theatrical plumes. The whole thing would have been quite impressive as you were walking behind a carriage at a slow pace. This was paid for by the members of the Kirk of Session. However, it would have been an expensive addition to any funeral at the time. Before this came into being in Glenisla, traditionally your funeral would have been focused around a cart pulling the body of the deceased. And in fact, the local joiner would have been acting as the undertaker. So this hearse has actually had many homes. If anybody had visited the original site for the Angus Folk Museum, which was in Glamis, they would have seen this displayed in the agri yard, so almost open to the elements to a large extent. However, in 2017, it was moved into storage to be conserved and examined to make sure it was in fit condition to be put back on display at the House of Dun. This was done in 2021, where the Angus Folk collection was moved into the courtyard, marrying the collection of the Angus Folk and the House of Dun itself. Through this item, we are able to tell the story of mortality, not just within the Angus Folk, of the people of Angus, sorry, but also of the family itself, and that it didn't matter whether you were from upstairs or downstairs, death comes to you all anyway. We do this by using the words of this woman. This is Violet Jacob. She was a daughter of the House of Dun. She was born Violet Erskine. And although she was considered one of the ladies of the house, she was inspired by the local dialect. And she was described as being one of the most, the best vernacular poet of her age. She took inspiration from the language that was used in the farmyards around the building. So actually tying her with the house to the Angus Folk collection and her affinity to those people, we are able to tell the story of the loss of many of the people who passed away during World War, but especially her son. So if you do happen to visit the House of Dun and the courtyard here today, you would be able to see her writing wrapping around the hearse itself, but also hear her words echoing through the room as we have audio playing as well. So it's really bringing the whole concept of death and traditions and rituals to life. Okay, so that's me. I'm quick.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, gorgeous object. I'm a big fan of Violet Dun, so it all sounds good. Excellent. Lovely. Right. Well, now we're off to Abernethy, and Angus McIntyre leaps into life there, and he's going to tell us about the Easter Cluny Pictish stone. So, Angus, see if we can make the technology work.
Is that us?
Looks good.
Okay, doc. Right. Hello, I'm going to talk about an item in the Museum of Abernethy, which we know as Easter Cluny stone, which is a Pictish cross slab fragment. Like Pictish stones generally, it's rather mysterious. It is thought that Christianity reached Abernethy in the early 5th century, possibly after the preaching of Ninian. The following century, Columba is said to have visited the area, and by 590 AD, the first stone-built church appeared in the village. There have been various places of worship on more or less the same site ever since. It seems to have taken some time for the local Picts to be fully converted, however, to Christianity. Although dated to the early Christian era, this granite stone, which stands close to our museum, has no Christian imagery at all, just Pictish symbols, and the symbols are in size rather than sculpted. The Easter Cluny stone, in contrast, shows skillful deep relief work and is rather complex. Despite its colour, it's classified as red sandstone. Possible dates range from 7th to 11th centuries, no more precise than that. Early Christian influences were usually either Irish or Northumbrian, but this stone is clearly Pictish in style, according to Edwina Proudfoot in her monograph on the ancient monuments of the area. A close look at the rings reveals that the inner and outer beads connect to the edges of the cross, while the inner two strands do not. This is best seen either top left or bottom right. Other aspects of the stone are, on the right side, a vertical key pattern. This is the reverse seen in a mirror, showing double bead interlace. And the top, which shows something similar. On the left-hand side, you have more key pattern. The stone is rather small, and when I was taking these photographs, I was kind of stumped as to how to indicate this. So I finished up with something that everybody can relate to. So where was this cross-slab fragment found? As a reference point, just out of the picture, at the top, the Tay runs from left to right. Now, if you follow the railway line from Abernethy on the left, up towards the right hand, the top right, you'll see circled Easter Cluny Farm, which is where the stone was found. Just this side of the Perthshire boundary with Fife. Coming down a bit and to the right, from there you'll see another circled place, and that is Macduff's Cross, or what is left of it. This is a view of it looking northeast. The top of the supposed pedestal shows signs of cup and ring marks, but has no recess to take a cross shaft. You'll notice how there are 3 quite deep holes on the side there. There's actually a 4th one at the bottom, but you can't see in this picture. So the question in my mind is, was that for rods to attach a cross shaft to? And here it is again, this time looking northwest with the Tay in the background. The large stone itself is about 1 metre high. To the left of the large stone, you can see an outbuilding of Easter Cluny Farm, so not far away, although Macduff's Cross is just in Fife. The Macduffs were a very powerful family, one of whom was the Thane of Fife mentioned in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Whatever form the cross took, it may have been erected for religious reasons or as a boundary marker, or both, but there was a tradition that anyone fleeing justice could find sanctuary there. In other words, Macduff would protect the culprit, no doubt for a hefty price. So, given how close to Macduff's Cross the Easter Cluny stone was found, could it have been part of that cross? Expert opinion suggests that this is doubtful because the stone seems too small to have been part of a large cross or even a boundary marker stone. And so the mystery continues. That's it.
Thank you so much, Angus. Great, we love a mystery. And I'm sure that that loo roll there was a deliberate reference to Louise's urinal talk there. So we've got
I was just thinking that continuing the lavatorial theme, you know.
Right, we're moving to Dundee again, and I'm delighted to welcome Kirsty Matheson from the McManus, Dundee's Art Gallery and Museum, who's going to tell us about another mystery, an intriguing portrait that's currently on show in their Hidden Histories exhibition. So, Kirsty, over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm Kirsty, art at the McManus Art Gallery and Museum. And what I want to talk about today is a very mysterious portrait of an unknown Black man dating from around the 1920s. To further add to the mystery surrounding this work, we don't know who the artist is, or do we? More on that later. So despite this lack of information, sorry, yeah, can you see that? Yeah. Despite this lack of information, the work has recently been conserved and is on display at the moment in our current Hidden Histories exhibition. So this is an exhibition that aims to represent historically marginalised groups as artists and sitters. And you might wonder why we would go to the effort of conserving and displaying a work when we have so little information about it. The simple answer is that it is a stunning example of 20th century portraiture and use of colour. However, it is also a rare example of Black representation in Western art, representation that is neither subservient or derogatory. But who was he and who painted him? And what clues can we glean from the work to tell us more about the societal and historical context in which it was made? So a little bit of context. You're supposed to get a quote there, but just, yeah, there we go. So a bit of context. So about Black representation in the history of Western art. So Black figures in traditional European paintings are typically in subordinate roles as servants or enslaved people, and there is often little or nothing known about their identities beyond their relation to a white figure. Figures with darker complexions were also fetishized for their exotic features. Marjorie Morgan, in her article, The Changing Face of the People of the African Diaspora in British Art, for an article she wrote for Art UK, says that the colonial influence is the undercurrent of many of the works that are present in the museums and art galleries of Britain. The white gaze is the unlabelled and ever-present curator of British art, especially relating to the depiction of people originating from the African continent. There is also the notion of Orientalism to consider. Orientalism is a term that describes how Europeans represented unexplored territories in regions of the Eastern or Islamic world. Post-colonial theorist Edward Said discussed Orientalism in his seminal book published in 1978. He described it as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So, who is he? And why don't we know? In recent years, there has been a huge push to redress wrongs imposed by Western colonialism on museum and art collections, and rightly so. We ask who was he, but who asked back then when it was painted? The writer and performer Patterson Joseph suggests that racism is not the easy answer, though it clearly plays its part. The issue is one of interest. If one is not taught that a people matter, then it is left up to that individual to discover this themselves. A rather ad hoc approach to any study, in my opinion, and subject to falling into negatively biased ethnic thinking. They are not us. They are not important to our story. They do not matter. During the 1920s, the UK was coming to terms with the loss of a young generation of men as a result of the First World War. In response, for some, the 1920s saw a cultural focus on glamour, escapism, and the modern, encapsulated in the Art Deco movement, which drew inspiration in part from exotic motifs from Britain's global empire. An example here of Orientalism at work. The popularity of jazz inspired visual artists, and as in this work, Black sitters were sought as models for their paintings. The turban and revealing costume indicate that this unknown artist was interested in depicting an exotic subject, yet there is also a striking humanity. More work is obviously required to discover the identity of this sitter, and we may be one step closer to achieving this in light of recent information as to the identity of the artist. So, who is the artist? While researching possible artists for this work, I had narrowed it down to a few possible contenders. And at this point, I would just like to thank Matthew for sending me the link to his article, which is about a Black artist model at Dundee School of Art in 1931. This was really useful and really helped in my research. So thank you. But even greater thanks are due to him for making me aware of a work that is due to be auctioned in Edinburgh next week. The timing is unreal for this. It's just mad. But anyway, yeah, so it's going on sale next week, and it's this work that you can see here. It's entitled The Blue Headdress, and it's signed. It's by the Fife-born artist Henry Young Allison. It is signed, and it's a portrait of a Black man who looks remarkably similar to our unknown sitter. The brushwork, the oriental clothing, and the use of colour is amazing in both. I know that it's the slide on the right isn't very good, but you can kind of see the lips. The way the lips are done is just uncanny, how similar they are. So yeah, the mystery is far from solved. There's still loads more information to be discovered, and we're actively working on it at the moment. So there's nothing conclusive right now, but we are so much closer to finding out who this sitter was, and we're pretty convinced that this could be the artist, so it's very exciting times. And I have got some further reading that you can see there. I guess if you want to look at this reading, you can just rewatch the recording and pause it here, and you can take a note. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. And if any of you haven't yet been to see the Hidden Histories exhibition, I do recommend it. Lots of amazing stuff. And yeah, wouldn't it be great if that turned out to be the right attribution? Great. Okay, thank you. So now we're moving over to Perth, and delighted to welcome Fiona Connor from the Blackwatch Castle Museum, who's got a really intriguing object for us, the face cast of Sergeant Robert Wilson. So Fiona, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so today I am going to be sharing one of the more unusual objects in our collection, that being the face cast of Sergeant Robert Wilson. And Sergeant Robert Wilson was a regular soldier with the Black Watch, and he joined in 1928, serving 8 years in India. And following the outbreak of the Second World War, the 1st Battalion was sent to France as part of the 51st Highland Division, where during the spring of 1940, Sergeant Wilson was hit in the mouth by a bullet. Luckily, he survived this injury. However, the roof of his mouth collapsed. And Wilson was really proud of his battle scars and asked to have a face cast created to mark this. And his family donated the mask to the museum with this in mind. And a few years ago, we included the mask in our temporary exhibition, The Art of War. And you can see here the different perspectives of the mask. And we are also really fortunate to have donated a series of photographs of Sergeant Wilson. And although many of these are badly damaged, they really highlight the impact of his injury. Oh, so you can see this image. This shows him before he went to the war. And it's accompanied by the report of his injury in the Dundee Courier in June 1940. And quite a handsome man in these pictures. But this next picture, you will see the full extent of his injury, which is really quite dramatic. And in this next picture, although it's quite difficult to see, in the image on what would be on my right, he is wearing a facial brace. And that helped him recover from his injuries. And here, in these pictures here, you can see the false teeth he was given. And these were to help kind of support his face. Oh, there's some other images there as well. And although Sergeant Wilson chose to have this cast made, many soldiers had masks made to hide disfigurement. And it's an interesting reminder of the developments of facial masks and surgery during the 2 World Wars. And facial injuries are really common in the First and Second World War. And the use of heavy artillery and machine guns in these conflicts meant that the number of facial injuries, previously only caused by sword cuts or light artillery, rose dramatically, and red-hot shrapnel from shells was designed to cause maximum damage. And this kind of injury was really difficult to treat on the front line, and soldiers only had, the surgeons only had time to sew up jagged wounds, which would then scar and tighten as they healed. And efforts were made, however, to reconstruct men's faces. And Dr. Harold Gillis, the father of plastic surgery, established the first ever hospital dedicated to facial injuries at Queen's Hospital in Sidcup in 1917. And the aim of the hospital was to reconstruct men's faces to allow them to lead as normal a life as possible, to be able to eat and speak, and in some cases, to be able to close their eyes or not suffocate when they lay down. And at a time when so many lost their lives, it was perhaps the case that sympathies were limited for those who survived. Dr. Gillis, who realised that these men were likely to be discriminated when looking for work, set up training schemes to try and counter this. But some would be unable to face the outside world and never left the hospital. And we've been thinking about our mask again, though. To rehabilitate disfigured soldiers, professional artists began to run mask workshops between 1918 and 1919. And Captain Francis Dermot Wood, who worked as a sculptor prior to his military service, oversaw the masks for facial disfigurement department, or as it was known, the Tin Noses shop at the 3rd General Hospital in London. And based on pre-war photographs and some artistic inspiration, his team moulded copper recreations of soldiers' faces. And you can see Captain Wood here, he's covering a patient's face with plaster to make a mask that he could then use to conceal his injuries. And here we have a selection of items that would be used to conceal face or injuries during the early development of plastic surgery. Included here are some eyes, ears and noses and parts of the face, as well as several pairs of spectacles, which were used to disguise the joints, but also to keep parts in place. And in here, this picture, Captain Wood is putting the finishing touches to a cosmetic place and comparing it to the face of the disfigured patient for whom it's being made. So this summer, we'll be displaying the face cast once again. And previously, we have looked at this case through the lens of art. But this time, it's going to be part of our new temporary exhibition, Repair, where we're going to highlight some of the incredible objects we have in the collection that were created as a result of injury and rehabilitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Gosh, what a fascinating story, and really interesting to what you were saying about the role of artists in that. I think that's fascinating. Right, we're coming back to Dundee now and to Verdant Works, and April Harvey is going to tell us about a book that they have called Essentials of Colloquial Hindustani, sorry. April, over to you.
Hi folks, as Matthew said, my name's April. I'm the Education and Communities Officer for Dundee Heritage Trust, and today I'm going to be talking about a book held in our collections called Essentials of Colloquial Hindustani for jute mills and workshops. So today I want to be talking about essentially why this book was published and how it came to exist, because of course nothing exists in a vacuum. And to look into that, we have to go all the way back to 1855, when the first jute mill was established in West Bengal in India. This was established by a Dundee jute baron, and he established it using not only Dundee machinery, but also Dundee workers. And from 1855 onwards, we saw tons and tons of jute mills springing up across the Hooghly River. All the Dundonian people going were always employed in managerial positions, so they were managers, overseers, very high up in the hierarchy. Of course, the British and the Dundee jute barons moved to India for a few different reasons. The main one obviously being exploitation. They were able to exploit the very cheap labour that was available there, as well as the natural resources, not just the jute, but also coal. And during this time, we were also seeing lots of factory acts being introduced here in Britain. So that meant they were trying to circumvent these laws that were harder to enforce over in India. When we talk about why this book was produced, we can take a quote from the author here where he says, "I may say it is just the book which is wanted by the Sahibs in the mill area. Sahibs is just a Hindi word for proprietor, so generally what we call a jute baron here in Dundee." And this gives you an idea of why the book was published. It was made for managers and overseers so they could better communicate with their workers. But what is probably more revealing is a quote here from the annual report of the Indian Mills Association, 1931. "Should acquire such a knowledge of the language as would enable them to make themselves clearly understood to the mixed crowd of uneducated workers with whom they came in contact during the course of their duties." The first colloquial Hindustani book was actually published in 1932 following this report, and you saw more and more editions coming out over the next couple of decades. Looking at this report, it also reveals that there had been quite a lot of industrial action happening throughout Calcutta at this time. It is largely disorganised and quite spontaneous, but there was lots and lots of outbursts happening, and this was meant to be a way to try and quell those outbursts, to speak to the people in their own language. But when you look into the book and you look at the sort of language that is used, it reveals a lot about the relationships that were there between the workers and their overseers and managers. Here are a few of the sentences that are translated into Hindustani for the people to learn. And you can see, I won't read them all out, but you can see they're all not particularly nice. For example, I'm telling you plainly, if you're going straight, you will be great loss. I see you not working again, you must be dismissed. And then, of course, there's a slightly longer quote at the top where the poor man has been prevented to go see his very ill brother. I find this book in particular really interesting because it was published the same year that India gained its independence from Britain, but yet the industrial action and the industrial relations continued long after that and still are today, especially in the jute industry. So that brings me to my end. I'm also quite quick, but if you have any questions, by all means, just put them in the chat, or you can always email me as well.
Thank you very much, April. Really, really interesting. Yeah, great. Okay, we have one more talk before we've come to the end of our first half, and we'll take a short break. So last but by no means least for this half, delighted to welcome Chris Martin from the Glenisla Folk Museum, who's going to be telling us about a Roman coin that had a kind of intriguing way of discovering it, I believe. So Chris, hand over to you.
Thanks, Matthew. So I'm going to be talking to you about the process of discovering an object that's not yet an official part of our collections, and it'll hopefully give you some interesting insight into the object itself and the work that goes into uncovering an object's past and significance. So late last year, one of our volunteers was searching in a packet of objects. Sorry, my slides aren't changing. Okay. Late last year, one of our volunteers was searching out objects for a research request, and as is so often the case, they came across a packet of papers that had no relation to one another and seemed to have been put together purely for coincidence. Among research notes, maps of German towns, catalogue cards, and collections audits, there were 2 envelopes. One had a 10p stamp on it, addressed but seemingly never sent, and the other was made of 2 pieces of card sandwiched together with yellowing tape. The first had a passage above the address, which read, "The name and address of the lady who asked annually about her bits and pieces she inherited from Jimmy Nicol, G." The second, in the same handwriting, says coin, which has been kept in Edinburgh being identified. As it may belong to someone who inquires about her possessions almost yearly, please keep it in a safe place. I think it originally belonged to the late Jimmy Nicol and passed to his heirs, MFM. G and MFM both indicate our founder and first curator, Margaret Fairweather Meekie, commonly known as Greta. This showed that the envelopes had been here since at least the 1980s and possibly as far back as the 1950s. Inside the packet, tucked inside a crumpled piece of acid-free paper, was the coin itself. A small but thick and surprisingly heavy object about the size of a 5-pence piece. Just visible on the now blackened surfaces are the image of a feminine face, and on the reverse a horn-like shape with the remnants of lettering struck beside it. Several questions needed to be answered. First, what was this coin and where did it come from? Second, who were Mrs. R.M. Lees and Mr. Jimmy Nicol? And third, how did the coin come to be in their possession? To answer the first, we needed some outside assistance. While curating a mixed collection gives you a little knowledge on a lot of things, Roman coins are far beyond my expertise. Thankfully, this is the bread and butter of the Treasure Trove office, so an email winged its way to them. Very soon there came a reply. The condition of the coin had made it difficult to find an exact comparison, but they were able to determine that it was a Roman provincial issue coin. Provincial coinage is the term used for coins made in the Roman Empire but outside of Rome itself for a number of reasons. The most common were coins issued in the name of city federations or celebrating alliances between cities, coins struck by friendly kings, and, like this one, the provincial issues, which were struck by important mints in locations such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Cappadocia, under the supervision of Roman magistrates. They were not intended for use across the empire, but instead would circulate in specific provinces. This practice sped up the ability for internal trade when the Roman Empire assimilated new locations, a practical solution that avoided the need for total collection and redistribution of coinage. During the Roman imperial era, there were over 600 provincial mints, most highly concentrated in the east. This coin is among those produced around the Mediterranean and Eastern Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, normally from a base silver alloy with a high copper percentage. Here you can see our coin in comparison to a similar example, though you'll see the faces of a different personage, and this one is made in Cappadocia in Turkey in 25 to 24 BC. Both coins feature the Cornucopia, the horn of plenty, and the inscription is most likely Greek. The lettering on our example is badly worn, but appears to show the lettering AI at the end. These features, the Treasure Trove officer explained, returned us to my original point of interest. How did the coin come to Jimmy Nicol? These coins are not found in a British archaeological context, let alone a Scottish one, so much more likely this came through as a collector's item. Perhaps Jimmy himself was the collector. I'm afraid I will have to keep you in suspense on that one, but I can't answer that question. Jimmy remains elusive, in no small part due to his misfortune in sharing a name with a one-time drummer for the Beatles. While all roads might lead to Rome, algorithms are more consistently drawn to the gravity of famous individuals. We have made ourselves slightly a step closer, though, thanks to the Grange Association of Edinburgh. This small charity was set up in 1974 for the preservation of the Grange, a district in Edinburgh with a long and rich history of its own. Findhorn Place, which was the address noted for Mrs. Lees, stands within the Grange's boundaries, though their historical minutes and notes unfortunately did not include the house we needed. But another email exchange and a message board thread later, and the residents of the Grange Association diligently uncovered Mrs. Lees, who was, as so often the case, addressed with her husband's initials on the identifying letter. Mr. Robert Malcolm Lee's family had been traced back to Brecon as far as the 1890s, and in 1956, he and Louise Johnson Dunbar were married. We do not yet know her relationship to Jimmy Nicol, and sadly can't ask herself as she passed away in 2007 at the age of 88. But since we had this communication, happenstance has continued to strike, and we've since discovered another scrap of paper in the archives confirming Louise as Mrs. Lees and noting the transfer of the coin from her possession to that of someone I believe to be her daughter. Following this thread may yet enable us to uncover how this Cappadocian coin has made its way to rural Angus and may add another chapter to its long and illustrious history. Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, what a fascinating story. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear how that mystery resolves itself or not, as the case may be. Lovely. Right. Well, that's us halfway through now, and we've had, gosh, what an amazing variety of things already, but there's lots more to come. So we're going to take a short break now. Let's see if we want to come back at, let's say, 8 minutes past. That'll just give you time to stretch your legs, go to the loo, have a cup of tea, whatever. And Fiona's going to take over chairing the second half. So, folks, we'll see you all back at 8 minutes past.
Okay, I think we'll probably just get started. There's still a couple of people to log back on, but it'd be great to get that second half started. So first of all, we're going over to Natasha at HMS Unicorn.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the kit receipt book from HMS Unicorn. So this dates back to the early 1900s, so 1910 I think is the first entry in it. So just a bit of context. Unicorn arrived in Dundee in the 1870s to be used as a training ship, and it stayed in that role for almost 100 years, but not quite. So there's a dearth of information about the men and women who actually served on Unicorn. So this is a really important item in piecing together who was on the ship at a certain time. It's the only record that we have of names that is directly linked to the ship. So I'm currently a documentation volunteer at the Unicorn, but I used to do a collections internship job share. So back in 2020, I transcribed the book and did some research on it with the help of some other volunteers. So I was able to do cross-referencing, which has made this a really vital document, because just from being able to look at the names written in the book, we could then find out a bit more information on things like service records and address, and then maybe even like articles and photographs at some stage as well. So this is a picture of inside the kit book. So it's a bit difficult to decipher. So at the bottom I've put what the top line says. So it's basically just listing who had been given their uniform when they signed up for the RNBR. And then the red seems to be when they had returned it. So these all seem to predate the First World War. Some of them were returned just a couple of months beforehand. and then these ones were given out just as the First World War broke out. So it gives us an idea of how many people would have been signing up around about that time. So although it was intended to just have a look at, who had what kit, it's actually proved really important in, giving us names to work on. So as part of the transcription and research, I made a huge spreadsheet. So I would type out the names that were in it. The categories at the top tell you the things that were given to the men when they signed up. So although we don't really need to know what specific hats and things were given out, although that is useful information as well, it's more about what we can do moving forward that has made me speak about this today. So over 300 men were named in the book, and I was able to do research on a lot of them. And it's given us a bit of a background by giving us like their address and the names of their next of kin, so then you can keep on researching and researching from that. And having been born and bred in Dundee, it's interesting to be able to piece together how these men lived their lives back then, and how the city's changed in the last 100 years or so. So moving forward, we have a huge amount of potential for the book. So we're really keen on piecing together the history of unicorns. So we know some key events that I would have been involved with, so like both world wars, and then when it shut down as a training ship and moved over to a museum. But we're always looking to get more information from anyone that has it. So anything to do with, even researchers wanting to come and use the kit book, and just tell us a bit more about the people who were on board and the type of training they underwent, that would be really useful as well. That's me.
Thank you, Natasha. What a wonderful source of information. That must have been a phenomenal amount of work you had to do in transcribing that.
It was.
Cool. So next we're going to have Naomi, who's from Inner Peffery Library, and she's going to be speaking about Robert Burns' Kilmarnock edition of poems. Thank you.
Thank you. Hoping that's sharing okay. So yes, the object from Inner Peffery Library that I'm going to talk about today is a first edition of Robert Burns's poetry, entitled Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect, but better known as the Kilmarnock edition, for the town where it was printed by John Wilson in 1786, to quickly translate those Roman numerals down there at the bottom of the title page. Its publication was paid for in advance by friends and supporters of the poet. This subscription model was a common means of raising funds to publish works in the 18th century, not unlike crowdfunding today. 612 copies were printed of the Kilmarnock edition, and of those, 300 went straight to the subscribers, and the remaining 300 sold out within a month. The success of this volume is often credited with convincing Burns to remain in Scotland. He had been on the verge of accepting a position as a bookkeeper in a plantation in Jamaica. And the Kilmarnock edition includes 36 poems, including well-known works such as Te Amus. And among the works, only 3 of them are songs. Burns's renown as a song composer and collector followed a little later, when his popularity and connections in Edinburgh Literary Society saw him involved in 2 very successful publications of Scots songs, examples of which we also have here in the collection. The huge popularity of this first edition meant that the Kilmarnock edition was very closely followed by the Edinburgh edition, which was printed less than a year later, greatly enlarged with around 30 more poems in it. And there were around 3,000 copies printed this time. The average edition size at this time for a work of poetry was under 1,000 copies. So to produce an edition of 3,000 copies gives us a clear evidence of Burns's ascendant fame. I'll turn now to what's unique and interesting about the copy that we have at Inner Peffery. It's been leather bound, replacing the plain board cover it would have had originally. And it was at one point owned by one Andrew Crawford Wright of Dalry. So we know his name, his occupation, and where he was from, because helpfully he wrote all this inside it. In 1826, Andrew Crawford was a founder member of the Dalry Burns Club. He was initially the club's secretary, then later its chairman. The club's website informs us that Crawford had a good library, he delighted in literature and was noted for antiquarian and archaeological pursuits. And like any true Burns fan, you can see here in the photograph that Crawford has noted down a bit of Burns graffiti next to the title page, which we can see in the image. It reads, "Epigram written by Burns with a pencil on a window shutter of an inn at Stewarton, where he had arrived, much fatigued from the wretched state of the roads." And then Burns's words read, "I'm here arrived, thanks to the gods, through roads rough, deep and muddy, a certain proof that making roads is not the public study. Although I'm not with scripture crammed, the gospel plainly says, the people surely shall be damned that do not mend their ways." So nothing much changes. We've clearly been grumbling about the state of the roads for an age and more, and it's nice proof as well that our national bard enjoyed a good pun. So how do we come to have this special book at the Library of Innerpeffray? The Kilmarnock edition isn't actually part of our original collection here. For any attendees who haven't heard of us, I'll just quickly say that Innerpeffray was Scotland's first public lending library, founded in 1680, and it lies near the town of Crieff in rural Perthshire. So, although we do have several volumes of Burns's work in the original collection that local folk would have been able to borrow from, we don't have a first edition like this one. Instead, this treasure is part of our Janet St. Germain collection, and she was an American book collector who amassed a wonderful collection of first editions of works by Scottish writers. In her words, she wanted to gift her books back to Scotland and happened to visit Innerpeffray when she was on a trip here just over a decade ago, and felt that this would be a suitable home for them, a place where people could enjoy them as she had. And she was very fond of music and poetry. And given that her maiden name was Burns, although there's no direct connection, she was particularly fond of Robert Burns, and so there are several works with a connection to him in her collection. And of the original 612 Kilmarnock editions that were ever printed, only roughly 80 are known to survive worldwide today. So we're very pleased to have this copy at Innerpeffray, where it can be enjoyed by all who visit as part of our exhibition this year. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Naomi. That's such a special example of something so important to our Scottish heritage. Oh, that must be just really special to see it. Oh. So it's back across to Matthew now from the University of Dundee Museums, and who is going to tell us all about a skeleton of a gorilla.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm sure many of you will recognise this skeleton. It's one of the most popular specimens in the D'Arcy Thompson Zoology Museum, as we can see from social media. We use it a lot in our advertising materials. So even if you've never been to the museum, you're likely to have seen the gorilla. It's a Western lowland gorilla, which unusually has the scientific name gorilla, gorilla, gorilla. So good they named it thrice. It's been in our collections a long time. Here it is in D'Arcy's original museum back in the 1890s. But it's only recently that we've really explored how D'Arcy acquired it. And that was prompted by a decolonising project that we undertook in the museum a couple of years ago. So most of the specimens in the museum were acquired by D'Arcy Thompson, our first professor of biology, in the 1880s and 1890s, which of course was at the height of empire. And looking at the collection as a whole, it quickly becomes apparent that a disproportionately large number of the specimens come from countries that were part of the British Empire or colonised by other European powers. So that raises important ethical questions about exactly how these animals were acquired. Now, D'Arcy himself was not a hunter. He didn't travel the world shooting animals, but he undoubtedly acquired specimens from others who did. Now, in the case of our gorilla, we know that it came, like a lot of his specimens, from an importer of live animals in Liverpool called William Cross. He was one of the most successful animal importers in the late 19th century, supplying live specimens to zoos and exotic pet owners in Britain and overseas. And the colonial nature of his enterprise was made explicit on his letterhead. You can see along the top there, it says known throughout the civilized and uncivilized world. In 1886, when the International Exhibition of Navigation, Commerce and Industry was held in Liverpool, one of the attractions was an Indian village featuring 50 natives of India and Ceylon imported and exhibited by Cross in exactly the same way as his animals. Well, Cross's collection grew so large that he actually opened it up to the paying public. His menagerie and museum, as it was called, was hailed as one of the biggest wild beast emporiums, if not the biggest, in the world. It was close to the docks, and therefore to the ships that both imported and exported his animals. People could look at creatures from faraway lands they'd never seen before, and Cross put on added entertainments, such as wrestling with lions or riding zebras across the city. Now, as these activities suggest, Cross undoubtedly mistreated his animals and kept them in fairly poor conditions. In 1898, a serious fire broke out in his premises, and hundreds of creatures were burned to death. But even discounting extreme events like that, Cross's animals had a pretty high death rate. And of course, that was when museums like Darcy's became important customers. Now, in the 1870s, there was a growing public interest in apes, especially chimpanzee and gorillas. In 1876, William Cross witnessed the arrival in Liverpool of what's believed to have been the first live gorilla to be successfully transported to Europe. The animal was on its way to Berlin, where it became a star attraction at the city's aquarium. It caused a sensation in Liverpool and was described as an actual demonstration of the missing link between the human and animal creation. Cross offered to buy the animal for £500, but the offer was refused. But 3 years later, he managed to obtain a live baby gorilla, and other animals followed. In 1893, he offered Darcy, quote, "one gorilla in barrel, good for skeleton, but I think not for stuffing, 40 shillings. So dead animals were usually sealed in barrels of salt water to preserve them long enough for them to be taxidermied, or in this case, macerated and articulated as a skeleton. Cross employed a team of hunters to venture into parts of the empire and capture as many animals as they could. But to catch a fully grown gorilla, you needed a specialist. And in the second half of the 19th century, the leading hunter of gorillas was the French-American adventurer Paul du Chaillu. In the 1860s, du Chaillu became famous as the first modern European to confirm the existence of gorillas in Africa, which he then shot in large numbers. We know that Cross definitely acquired some live specimens from du Chaillu, but by 1893 he was in his 60s and had largely given up hunting, so it was probably someone else who captured our gorilla. However, we know that Darcy met du Chaillu because in 1890 he actually came here to the university to give a public lecture, which Darcy attended. In the talk, he told comical and highly condescending stories about African people and related his first encounter with what he called the fighting gorilla, claiming to have been the first white European to have killed one in 2,000 years. So that's just one of the various stories that emerged from our decolonising project. And if you're interested in finding out more, we have a booklet available, which I'll pop a link to in the chat. And of course, you can come and visit the museum. We're open every Friday afternoon from June to August and monthly on Saturdays throughout the year. And that's it from me. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That really is quite a fascinating and quite horrifying background to how museums were acquiring specimens back then. Cool. So next we're going over to Emma at Angus Alive, and she's going to tell us all about an embroidered panel said to have adorned the walls of the Imperial Palace in China.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me today. I'll just share my screen. So yes, I am talking about this very interesting embroidered panel. I'm going to tell you how it came to Arbroath and also why I'm talking specifically about it today. Now, if you've been to Arbroath Library before, you might have noticed these display cases at the top of the stairs. They've long held a collection of embroidery, but until this year, we didn't really know what was in there. In those cabinets, there were some photographs, some newspaper articles, and a minutes book from the 1950s and 60s. And it appears that in the 1950s, there was a small display held by local women. You can see a picture of that on the right. It garnered a lot of interest, and in 1956, we can see that there was a first note of interest in holding an embroidery club. So the club ran on Thursday evenings at the Royal Hotel and for a fee of 15 shillings. Now, the club really wanted to preserve the history of embroidery. They wanted to share that with people. This was a time when much of it was being discarded. So they wanted to show the cultural value of what they had. So this is an image from their first public exhibition. That was in 1957. They held subsequent exhibitions, and in 1961 they had over 700 visitors from all over Scotland. So with an increasing number of exhibitions and donations, they really needed somewhere to store what they had and to keep it safe. So just another couple of images there. You can see some other pieces, and you can see some of the guests attending one of the exhibitions. Now, they got in touch with Arbroath Library, and they spoke to Norman Crawford, who was librarian in 1961. And he said he would do everything possible to further the project, so giving them space for their collection. Here we've got some minutes from a meeting that's between the Library Art Committee and some members of the Embroidery Club. And they emphasise here that the collections, not just for historical items, but it's for the inclusion of future developments in the field of needlework. They want to emphasise local objects with local connections, and they speak about having cabinets made for these. Now, I love this letter. It shows how forward thinking they were, and you'll see that they say, I think I should contact the V&A, which is obviously great given that we've got the V&A in Dundee now as well. So some further advice from the V&A was to label all of their objects and to write a little catalogue. So Mrs. Shaw, one of the members, she created these labels, which are still on the objects, and she, in a notebook, she wrote down 162 objects. So this is an image from the inaugural ceremony where they handed over the embroidery collection. And in this article, they speak about how it's not just a display cabinet, but in 100 years, these cabinets will keep the collections in a good state of preservation. Now here you can see an image from the back of the cabinet. So there's like a tabletop display at the top, and then at the back, you can open out these drawers. This is what we discovered earlier this year. Now, moving on, it appears in the 1980, which is what this letter shows, is that the then Angus District Council appeared to take on the collection, the management of the collection. But that was 1980, this is 2023. Why am I only talking about this now? I think it's just an age-old story. You know, very small museum team, stretched budgets, and we are very lucky that the past year we have had Museums Galleries Scotland funded posts under this remit. The embroidery collection fell, which was really great. So it's Ingrid Leon who we've got in that post, and she's been fantastic, and without her I don't think we'd be able to have done this work. So I wanted to talk about one item in particular. It's really fascinating if what's recorded about it is true. It appears to have originated as part of the wall coverings from the Chinese Imperial Palace. This was home to 24 Chinese emperors between 1420 and 1911. Now, the distinctive golden yellow of the silk, that indicates that it would have been used decoratively for royal residencies, as it was the colour that signified supreme power. Here's a little close-up. Now, the provenance, quite interesting. Mrs. Shaw, who helped catalogue the original list, it was apparently purchased by her brother in 1935, and he bought it from refugees from the old regime. He carried it back to England. It survived the London. Sorry, it survived the London Blitz, and then was donated into the collection. We've got a lot more research to do on symbolism there. Yellow flowers generally represent wisdom and wealth and prosperity, but I need to work out what the flowers actually are. Not a gardener. And birds generally signify freedom, but again, I need to work out what the birds are. So just a brief example of some other things in the collection. It's really varied. What are we doing with it? We're basically accessioning everything. We're photographing it, we're repacking everything safely, we're moving it to a collection store, and it will culminate, hopefully, in a really great exhibition to showcase the great work that these ladies did. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That's a beautiful piece of embroidery. I love some of the images, particularly the pictures of all the ladies with their hats on. So
it's great, isn't it?
So we're now going over to the Dundee Museum of Transport, and Beth is going to talk about 2 driver's badges belonging to Pamela Scott.
Hi there everyone, I'll just quickly share my screen and then we can get started. So hi everybody, just as a quick introduction, I am Beth, the Community Engagement Officer at Dundee Museum of Transport, and today I will be telling you about a driver badge and a conductor badge belonging to Pamela Scott. These are currently on loan from Ian Scott, Pamela's son. Unfortunately, I can't hold up my objects as they're currently on display within the museum, but hopefully this picture will give you a good idea of what they look like. But to me, it's the story behind them that makes them so interesting. Dundee Museum of Transport recently hosted their first Women in Transport exhibition at the start of this year from the 1st to the 27th of March. This also coincided with this year's Dundee's Women's Festival. Our museum covers all aspects of transport, past, present and future, and we wanted to create an exhibition which inspires women and girls by using our collections a different way, researching hidden stories and accessing new audiences. During the process of curating the exhibition, we opened our doors to local stories of inspiring women to demonstrate that transport-related jobs and careers are not just for men, one of which was Pamela Scott. Pamela's son contacted the museum just as we were starting to plan the exhibition, and we knew that she had to be included. Sadly, Pamela passed away more recently, but her son was able to share her stories and some objects with us. Pamela Scott was a clippy, also known as a bus conductress, from Dundee who became the first woman in Scotland to earn her Public Service Vehicle, or PSV, driver's licence. As a result, she had earned a conductor's badge and a driver's badge. Driver and conductor badges had to be visible and worn by crews at all times by law. If a conductor or driver were seen without their badges, they could be fired. Red badges were worn by the drivers and the green badges were worn by the conductors. On one-man buses, drivers were required to wear both a red and green badge as they carried out both jobs. As you can see in the photos, Pamela's conductor badge looks far more worn than her driver's badge. I'll just go back to that quickly so you can have a quick look at that. So the green one was her conductor badge. But Pamela never got her chance to drive a public service bus in Dundee. In the last week of May 1968, Pamela was due to start her new job driving buses from Dundee to Lucas Airfield for Alexandra and Sons Northern Bus Company. Despite the Dundee bus depot being 50 drivers short at the time, Mrs. Scott was unable to start her new career as her appointment as a driver was met with fierce resistance from the male drivers and conductors at the bus station. The men objected to women driving a bus and they threatened industrial action, including strike, if Pamela was allowed to take up the post. The Transport and General Workers Union, of which Pamela was the depot shop steward, gave no support to the proposed strike, as their policy was to support the equality of sexes. Pamela never did drive a service bus in Dundee, but she had a varied and successful career as a driver, despite initial hurdles. Alexandra's created a limousine service where their female PSVL drivers took prestigious clients like politicians such as Enoch Powell and pop stars including Paul McCartney to the major airports via Fife. The service used Ford Dorchester limousines and later 16-seater luxury Bedford Vista coaches. As the service became more popular but a little less exclusive, the cars were replaced by the buses. It was another 3 years before Elizabeth Brindley made headlines in 1971, becoming Dundee Corporation's first woman bus driver. And London didn't have a female bus driver in service until 1974. We have around 20 conductor and driver badges in our collection and on display within the museum, but none have a story quite incredible as Pamela's. Moving forward, we hope to collect the stories behind the driver and conductor badges in our collection and are keeping this in mind with any new acquisitions. At the start of this year, we were gifted a driver's badge belonging to a local Dundonian who worked at the Dundee bus station as a mechanic, but he was also required to obtain his licence so that he could fill in if they were short of drivers due to illness. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit more about Pamela and her fascinating story.
Thank you so much, Beth. It's really interesting to hear more about the role of women in such a male-dominated industry.
Definitely.
Hopefully more stories like that will come out.
Yes, we're hoping to do a bit more.
Okay, well, we'll move on to the next talk then. We're going to now hold over to Kim at Discovery Point, who is going to speak about the Harmonian mysteries, if you're ready, Kim.
Yep, absolutely. There we go. So let's get this going. Lovely. So welcome to the Harmonium mysteries. And there's been a few mysteries today, which has been quite exciting. Just waiting for there we go, just to catch up. So yeah, my name's Kim Turford. I'm the Education and Communities Coordinator at Dundee Heritage Trust. And my colleague April was speaking about verdant works. So I'm going to speak about something from the Royal Research Ship Discovery and Discovery Point. So my first question was, what is a harmonium? Because it's not a very common object. So it's also been called a melodeon, a reed organ, a pump organ. The way I describe it to kids is it's sort of like a piano and an organ sort of mixed together a little bit. Essentially, you blow air through the reeds on some of them, and that is by using a foot pump, like a pedal. And on others, it's by pushing in similar to an accordion, and that makes the musical notes. So the next question that automatically comes to everyone is, why does the Discovery, a ship that went down to Antarctica, have a harmonium? So the general answer is that they didn't just go straight down to Antarctica. They stopped off at a few different places on the way. And one of the last place that they stopped was in a little town called Littleton, which was near Christchurch in New Zealand. And as they were there, they made lots of friends, they attended lots of parties, lots of lunches, some of them even fell in love with the local girls. And upon leaving, a huge celebration was put together, and a whip round was essentially had to get them some gifts. Now, another day I will talk to you all about the sheep that they were gifted by the people of New Zealand, but today specifically we are going to talk about the harmonium that was gifted. So you can see here on screen a few of the newspaper articles, either from the Bishop of Christchurch, who is saying that this harmonium will cost around £30 to £40, and then subsequently that they were able to secure it, and then latterly that it was handed over to the Discovery team for use of their Sunday services when they were all the way down in Antarctica. So did they actually use it? The answer is yes, thankfully for all those people who donated their hard working money. There was only one musician aboard, however, and that was a gentleman called Royds, though he is said to have preferred the piano. We sometimes hear it referred to as a pianola, which is essentially a self-playing piano. We think there may have been some sort of attachment that went onto it. This meant that he could either, just set it off playing whilst they were all doing something more genteel of an evening, for instance, writing in their diaries or letters home, though he did, as directed, almost play the harmonium every Sunday for their church service. But he was much more preferable to the piano and than the harmonium, because that's what he'd been used to. And we can see here that it even made it to the South Polar Times. So you can see Poplar and Blackwall, the two ship's cats there, sat in front of the harmonium, saying that it wasn't them who stole our Charlie's sardines. I'm not sure I believe them, though. So why is there a mystery? Well, there are two harmoniums currently at Discovery Point. So one of them we got was part of the ship when we purchased it from the Heritage Trust, and has been on display in the museum since it opened in 1993. From this point on, I will refer to this as the tall harmonium, as it is a tall harmonium. And there's the other one which turned up last year from a wealthy donor, with the plaque stating that it had been gifted by the citizens of Christchurch, New Zealand to the Discovery. I'm going to refer to this one as the short harmonium, as it is short. And you can see that there's a problem here. It was very, very unlikely that they took a piano and 2 harmoniums down with them to Antarctica. So, which one is the imposter? So, what did we do next? We scratched our heads a little bit, and thankfully we had a lovely student called Gabrielle who was set to the task of finding out which was the one harmonium to rule them all. She produced a fab report, which I'm happy to share widely with you afterwards if you're interested, but I'll go over the highlights for you now. So, all of the newspaper reports state that the harmonium was the tall harmonium was made by Wilcox and White in Connecticut. The short harmonium was made by Murdoch & Co. Limited in London. So that's 1-0 to the tall harmonium. The second one, sketches shown earlier indicate the harmonium was ornately decorated and had curved legs. This matches the tall harmonium and not the short one. So 2-0, tall harmonium. The plaque on the short harmonium that I mentioned gave a start and an end date of the expedition. Now, considering that they stayed longer than expected, this isn't something that would have been known by the people that gave the gift in 1901. So it's likely that plaque was added afterwards, and it would likely mention Royds was the one who took the piano and the harmonium with him after they returned home. So 3-0 to the tall harmonium. I think you can guess which way this is going now. Finally, the plaque on the long harmonium gives no dates. It states that it was to be used for church services on board, which matches the newspaper reports, and there are all things that would have been reasonably known. The plaque is also placed inside of the object, therefore not disrupting the beauty of it, whereas on the shorter harmonium, it's stuck right on the front, which feels a little bit odd. So we have a winner, pretty much a knockout that the tall harmonium, we're 95% certain, is the real one. Phew. Helpfully, the object we've been carrying for the last 30 years is what we believe to be the real harmonium, but we now have a rather large harmonium with no provenance. So Gabrielle came up with a few suggestions. One of my favourites was, hoist it up the mast and see what happens. Got told we maybe couldn't do that. But we did decide on 2 things. Firstly, to gut the short harmonium and use its inner mechanisms as potentially part of the display of the tall harmonium when we do our Transformed project, which will hopefully give some context as to how such an unusual object works. And also to place the short empty harmonium on the ship, once it's a lot lighter, close-ish to where it would have been originally, and potentially have the ability to activate music which might have been played by Royds, or encourage people to have a go at pretend to play it themselves. Nice little photo opportunity. So there you go, there are our 2 harmoniums. You can come and see the actual real one in Discovery Point whenever you like. However, the short harmonium has been sent away to be disemboweled. So watch this space, and very soon you may be able to see the short imposter harmonium living a new life. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. What a fascinating mystery for you to solve there. A plug for us here, we have a harmonium as well on display. It's a much, much smaller one. And it was taken to the Western Front for services during the First World War. So it's quite a nice piece too. So finally, we are moving over to the Scottish Crannog Centre, and Amy is going to tell us all about the foundation timbers of the Crannog.
Yeah, so my name's Amy. I am the curator at Scottish Crannog Centre. I did Tayside Treasures last year as a volunteer, so it's really nice to be back as curator this time. So briefly, we are an Iron Age museum on the side of Loch Tay, so we're up near Kenmore. We did have a construction of the Crannog on site, the one that's pictured in this photo here, but it sadly burnt down in 2021. But we are currently in the process of building a whole new site, including a new Crannog, which is very exciting, and I'll discuss that a little bit later on. But today I'm going to talk about the foundation timbers of the Crannog, so the stilts that are driven into the loch bed. So this is just a map here to show you where we are. So the Scottish Cranog Centre current site is where the purple arrow is, and we are moving just along to where the green arrow is. So Cranog itself is an artificial or man-made island with a house on top, and they were particularly popular in the Iron Age. Oakbank Cranog is one of 18 that was discovered on Loch Tay altogether, and the majority of our collection is from this site. Excavations began there in the 1980s and they continued right the way up until 2003. So this here is a picture of the 5 supporting uprights that we have in the museum on display. There is a 6th one that is in a different cabinet. They're all made out of alder wood, apart from the one in the other cabinet, which is elm. They were made from complete round wood, often with the bark still on, and fashioned with axes. But getting them to the lock bed themselves is quite a task. So it's all clay on the lock bed, so you can't just hammer these objects in or they would fall straight back out again. So instead you have to taper them to a point at the bottom. You then attach a second log across the top to make a T shape and then twist them in. So this moves the clay enough to drive that point right into the lock bed. So it goes about 1.5 meters down, and then the clay will harden back around these posts, keeping them nice and secure. Someone has written a whole PhD on these, as they have really wonderful tool marks preserved on there. So this PhD student deducted that there's between 5 to 10 axes that were used. So suggestion there is that there were 5 to 10 people working on these stilts anyway, so a relatively small team could be working on the Cranog structure. One of these timbers has much shallower axe marks on there, and the suggestion is that it was perhaps an apprentice that did these instead. So we are currently in the process of building our new sites. At the moment, we're doing an Iron Age roundhouse on the land, so we are playing around with multiple different Iron Age structures. We will then place in a new museum, cafe and shop as well. And once the site is open for tours, we will start to build a new Cranog. And the idea is that this will become incorporated into the tours. You can watch a Cranog being constructed as well. We will be using all sorts of traditional skills, techniques, Iron Age replica axes as well. I've got a quick video of them constructing the roundhouse at the moment. So you can see they're currently working on woven hazel hurdle walls as well. So it's been really lovely to be working with the uprights to inform this process, because we are talking a lot about building different structures at the moment. And as you can see from the pictures before, the timbers are currently stored in water tanks, which has served them well over the years, but they are now in a bit of a need for some conservation. So I'm in the process of planning for a project, which I will hope can be based around the timbers and foundations and what that can mean to people, whether it be physical foundations or not. This will also involve sending the timbers away for conservation as well. They won't be on display for a year or so, but once we have them back, they'll be out of the water tanks and much more easily accessible to staff, visitors, volunteers, everything like that. We have been watching our small Cranog community expand massively in the past few years since the fire, so I'm really looking forward to working with our whole community and helping to build and create a brand new home for us on our new site, which will hopefully be open at the end of this year. But thank you very much for listening. If you do have any questions, my email is just at the bottom of this PowerPoint and I'm happy to answer anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's fantastic to hear about all the new plans for the Cranog. And I'm sure it's going to be wonderful when it's all completed. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. So that's the end of all the talks. But before we finish, I'd like to thank Matthew for all his hard work in organising yet another wonderful Tayside Treasures. I think everybody will agree that it's been a really fantastic event. And thank you to everybody who's spoken today and highlighted the diverse range of objects held throughout Tayside. It's really quite incredible what everybody has. And finally, thank you for everyone who's taken the time to come and attend this event. And we hope that you've all enjoyed it as much as we have. So thank you very much.